Hello everyone and welcome to our week 7 talk. This week we've got Stefano from A3 talking about NoRegret hydrogen. So your PowerPoint's disappeared. Could you reshare your screen?
Sorry about that, not sure what happened.
No worries.
And let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, that's all good. Cool.
Cool. So thank you for having me. Today my talk is going to be about hydrogen, and the title is From Hype to No Regret, and my objective is to cover some basics about hydrogen and then move on and talk about a project that we recently completed for a client in Germany, looking at the infrastructure to transport and store hydrogen. So first of all, an introduction about A3 and about myself. So A3 is an international engineering and advisory company supporting many clients across different processes in sustainability and digitalization. We are currently about 16,000 people, and we have office in about 40 countries with projects in over 100 countries. We have 5 divisions that span across the energy division to the infrastructure and management consulting. And on the right-hand side, you can see my picture. My name is Stefano Andreola, and I'm a senior consultant at A3 Management Consulting. I have about 6 years of experience in consulting, and I have been specializing in energy and in the energy transition and decarbonization in particular. Recently, I have been working on several projects involving hydrogen, and we have formed a hydrogen expertise cluster within A3, which is composed of 3 divisions. Starting from the top right one, we have the energy division, which focuses on the engineering services. The process industry division, which focuses more on the chemical side of things and the process involved. And then finally, the management consulting division, which is the division where I sit, and it is a division that focuses and has a deep expertise in electricity and gas, recently focusing a lot on hydrogen, but in general covering the whole spectrum of strategy advice, market analysis, project design, and financing. Here we have an example or a selection of our clients for whom we have performed hydrogen-related projects, which vary in scope and also in the type of clients. So some of our clients are transmission system operators on the gas and electricity side, banks, utilities, think tanks, and the range of projects is very large in scope. So it can go from strategy, support, to project initiation and support across the engineering and procurement of projects. So in my agenda, I would now like to talk about hydrogen before we move on and talk about the specific project. So why is hydrogen relevant now? You might have heard quite a few news recently about hydrogen announcements, but the main driver behind it is that hydrogen can play a role in decarbonization. So on the left-hand side, you can see a stacked bar chart with emissions across various sectors. And what what you might notice is that the current level of emissions, or emissions from 2018, is over 4,000 million tons. And when we look at the ambitions of the EU and also behind the EU to achieve net zero, or a very strong reduction in emissions compared to 1990 level, you can probably see that the ambition is very big, and to achieve that, we can't afford not even one of the single segments that are currently drawn in on the chart to be fully emitting the level of emissions that is currently emitting. And for this reason, hydrogen can play a role, and in particular, it can help with the decarbonization of industry, of transport, heating, and also of the power sector. If we look a little bit more into the detail of each of these four sectors, hydrogen can be used in industry as feedstock, as for refineries, so effectively for its chemical structure, and also as a reaction agent, still for its chemical structure. It can also be used in heating, and the beautiful part of hydrogen is that compared to fossil fuels, when you burn hydrogen, you don't have any CO2 emissions like you do with fossil fuels, including natural gas. And so you can decarbonize domestic heating, but also industrial heating. With the same logics, you could use hydrogen in the power sector and run gas turbines with hydrogen with no CO2 emissions. And finally, in mobility, you can also use hydrogen with fuel cells that can convert hydrogen into electricity and be used in vehicles. The other advantage of hydrogen, and the reason why it's being talked about, is because it can have a role in those sectors that are not easy to decarbonize with electrification. And the four sectors that I mentioned have some noticeable examples, such as trucks that would be difficult to electrify, as batteries would struggle to deliver the required range for a truck journey. At A3, we carried out quite a few studies over the past years, looking at the role of hydrogen in these four sectors, in power, heating, and transport. And the role of hydrogen ranged quite widely, from 1,000 terawatt-hour to almost 5,000. And just to put the number in perspective, the current electricity demand across Europe is about 3,000 terawatt-hour. So we're looking at a number that is not negligible, especially if you compare it to today's level of hydrogen demand in Europe, which is about 200 terawatt-hour. So let's look at the current role of hydrogen. We hear all the news about potential uses of hydrogen that I just mentioned, but where is hydrogen used today? So on the left-hand side, you have a chart showing the global demand for hydrogen. And as you can see, the vast majority of it is used in two processes, so the refining of oil and the production of ammonia, with the remainder used in other chemical processes and DRI, which means direct reduced iron, and it's a process to produce steel. The bad news for hydrogen today is that it's not part of the decarbonization picture, as it's mostly produced with fossil fuel. So on the right-hand side, you have a chart that shows how the full demand for hydrogen today is met, and that is largely through natural gas or coal, with a part being byproduct, which is production of hydrogen that happens spontaneously from certain chemical processes. As you can see, there is a very big gap, even looking at the production today. If we want to achieve full decarbonization, if you notice that on the chart on the right-hand side, only 2 million tons of hydrogen are currently produced in a way that is carbon neutral or almost carbon neutral, which is electrolysis and natural gas combined with carbon capture and storage, or CCS. So before we move further on, I think that it's worth mentioning a few of the colors of hydrogen that you might or might not have heard and will appear later in the presentation. So the first one is gray hydrogen, and we refer to gray hydrogen to the hydrogen that is produced by the reformation of methane through a process that is called steam methane reforming. And this process, as a result, emits CO2 into the atmosphere, so it's not a carbon neutral hydrogen production. The second method is called blue hydrogen, which is similar to gray hydrogen, but the CO2 doesn't get released into the atmosphere because it gets captured with carbon capture and storage. There is another technology that is typically considered blue hydrogen, which is methane pyrolysis, which is still not a fully mature technology, but the idea would be that methane would be converted to hydrogen in an oxygen-free atmosphere, and so there would be no combustion, and the byproduct would be solid carbon rather than CO2 that gets stored away. And finally, we have the renewable hydrogen, or green hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced from renewable energy sources, typically wind and solar, with an electrolyzer that can split water molecules to produce hydrogen. There are also a few more colors of hydrogen, which I won't mention to confuse you, but it's quite interesting to see many colors of hydrogen popping up every day. So the other part of the story of why hydrogen is interesting now is because it has received a lot of attention from countries and also from the European Union. So the most noticeable, the most important and relevant piece of policy created so far for hydrogen is the EU hydrogen strategy, which foresees a capacity of 40 gigawatt of electrolyzers by 2030, involving about 450 billion euros of funding. So to put those numbers into perspective, if we wanted to build 40 gigawatt of electrolyzers and supply them with renewable electricity, we would need to install about 120 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, and that is equivalent to the full installed renewable energy sources capacity in Germany today. So that is the full solar PV capacity, wind onshore, wind offshore, and also bio-based fuels. And with this 40 gigawatt of electrolysis, we could produce about 10 million tons of hydrogen today, 10 million tons of hydrogen, which is around the amount of hydrogen used today in Europe, equivalent to about 300 terawatt hour. So this is a very, very ambitious target, and it's ambition also in the short term, when by 2025, so in 4 years' time, the hydrogen strategy envisages the building of 6 gigawatt of electrolysis which would translate roughly to 11 gigawatt of additional offshore wind, or about 900 wind turbines to be built in 4 years. So again, something very, very ambitious. So what are the conclusions, and how did the project that I will talk to you about links with this discussion? When we look at the individual country announcements and targets, which you can see on the chart on the left-hand side, here you can see the electrolyzer capacity targets announced by each country in the EU. And what you can see in the yellow bar is that there is a gap with a target of 40 gigawatt of installed capacity that we mentioned before. It's also worth bearing in mind that currently there is only about 1 gigawatt of installed capacity across Europe, and mostly with very small plants of a few hundred kilowatts each. So what are the reasons for such gap? One potential explanation is that there is a coordination issue between the demand users, so the installations that would make use of hydrogen, the producers of hydrogen, and also some infrastructure that might be needed to deliver the hydrogen from where it's produced and where it's needed. And such coordination issue translates in some uncertainty on when the production, the demand, and the delivery system would come into place, and therefore guaranteeing some certainty to the investors that would like to invest in one of the three to go ahead with their investments. So the aim of the project that I will talk to you about was exactly to try and reduce the uncertainty coming from this coordination gap or coordination issue, and looking at the so-called no-regret demand. So we use this term to mean the demand that we can be almost certain that will be there in the future. And the first step to estimate that was to look at a map of emissions in Europe and in industry, which is where hydrogen is currently used. So when we look at the chart on the left, we can see that the main emitters that pop up are iron in blue, with very large plants spread out across Europe, cement plants, the green dot that are much smaller but also much more scattered around, and then refineries, so the black marks. And the interesting part is that in two of these three segments, hydrogen has a role to play. When we look at the map on the right-hand side, we have an emission heat map that shows the hotspots for emissions in Europe from industry. And it's worth noting that the region around the Netherlands and Belgium is the most highly concentrated emission area, and it is also one of the areas where hydrogen has the largest use currently. So after we've introduced the concept of low or no regret demand, I will give you an overview of what the project we did for Agora Energiewende, what we did for this project. So we naturally divided the project into three phases. So the first one was about demand and the no regret demand. The second part was about supply, so looking at how hydrogen could be produced, looking at renewable energy sources potential, but also methane reforming with carbon capture and storage, where carbon capture and storage is available, and then made a range of assumptions about technology cost and the cost levelization. And then finally, a delivery system phase, where we assessed what would be the best way to connect the demand and the supply. And to do so, we made use of a concept called Exogrid, which consisted of dividing Europe into hexagons and then finding the cheapest way to connect demand and supply hexagons. I will now look a little bit more in detail about each of the three phases of the project, starting with demand. The chart that I am currently showing gives a very clear message when you look at it from a high level perspective, which is that the total demand for hydrogen in Europe will remain fairly constant over time, going from just over 250 terawatt-hour per annum today to below 300 terawatt-hour per annum in 2050. The composition of such demand, however, varies across time, and the key trend is that we see steel becoming a large source of demand for hydrogen and increasing starting from 2030 onwards, whereas the demand for hydrogen in refineries declines very steeply, especially after 2030, and reaching zero in 2050. This was an assumption of the study, where we thought that to achieve carbon neutrality, hydrogen demand in refineries in Europe should disappear by 2050. When we look at the other segments on the chart, we can see refinery, ammonia, methanol, and the chemical recycling of plastics. And what these processes have in common is that hydrogen is used for its molecular structure, so either as a feedstock or as a reaction agent, and is not used to be burned. So a key assumption of the study was that we considered the no-regret demand only the demand of hydrogen that is not used in combustion processes. The reason being that there are alternatives, and therefore, if you were to assume that demand for hydrogen for combustion process is to be considered no regret, you might come and regret it in the future if other technology prove to be better than hydrogen. As I touched upon in the introduction to this study, the geographical dimension that we gave is an exogrid. So we plotted everything on hexagon definition. And here you can see the translation of the previous picture that I showed you onto a map. So how did we go from a demand for hydrogen into different sectors to a demand across Europe? We used a couple of metrics. So one was carbon emissions. So we identified plants that emitted CO2 and assigned the amount of hydrogen depending on their level of emissions. And for the steel sector, we looked at the capacity of each individual steel plant to produce steel, and we assigned the total hydrogen demand to the plants. What we notice in this chart is that there are some fairly clear clusters of demand of hydrogen, and it becomes more noticeable in 2050 compared to 2030. And this is because between 2030 and 2050, many refineries close, and refineries are typically spread out, and more hydrogen is used in the steel manufacturing plant, and steel manufacturing plants are larger inside, but less spread out. The obvious region that gets identified, that you can identify on this map, is the so-called trilateral region. So the region between Netherlands, Belgium, and the north of Germany, where we have some hexagons with a very large demand for hydrogen, which is indicated in the numbers on inside the hexagons. There are also some other isolated demand clusters, some of them in Eastern Europe, some of them in Southern Europe. It's also interesting to note that there is a very isolated hexagon in Lithuania, and it's also a fairly large one with 14 terawatt-hour of hydrogen demand in 2050, and that is due to a large ammonia plant alone that would make up for that demand. So this was the first part of the project, the demand side of things. And when we move on to the supply part of things, the first two maps that I want to bring to your attention are the solar PV and wind onshore and offshore potential maps. So from the solar PV potential map, a very clear message emerges. Resource potential is much higher in the south and lower in the north. This is something to be expected. But when we look at the wind chart, the picture is much less clear cut. So you have very good locations in the north of Europe, and in particular around offshore locations. But you also have some pockets of good spots, the dark blue hexagons in Southern Europe, and in particular in North Africa, which is interesting, as people might think that North Africa is only a good spot for solar PV. Before I move on to the next slide, I was going to say, so the logical next step for this project was to assess what would be the cost of producing hydrogen in these locations, apart from how good the resource potential is. And so to do so, we made use of two scenarios, which we called blue, green, and fast green. And if you remember or are familiar with naming, blue means hydrogen produced with fossil fuels and carbon capture and storage, and green with renewables. And so the blue-green, we allowed hydrogen delivered or produced from methane reforming with CCS in those countries where CCS is available, and those are the UK, Norway, and the Netherlands. Whereas in the fast green, we didn't allow CCS and SMR to play a role in the production of hydrogen. The other element that characterizes the scenarios is the technology cost assumptions that we used. So across both scenarios, we used some fairly aggressive cost reduction assumptions regarding renewables, wind and solar. But one thing that distinguishes the fast green from the blue green is the level of electrolyzer capital expenditure that we assumed. So in the blue green scenario, we assumed a constant, fairly rapid declining costs during until 2050. Whereas in the fast green scenario, we assume a very, very sharp declining cost from today's level to 2030. And this is in line with the target set by the European hydrogen strategy. So what does that mean in terms of our maps and hexagons? when we look at the 2030 picture, one thing that we can clearly see from the blue-green scenario is that methane reforming with CCS or SMR CCS on this chart in purple color is a fairly important producer of hydrogen, or the technology that would be the most economical one in most places where it is allowed, in Norway, the UK, and the Netherlands. And also that the green spots are dominating Central Europe. Green is hybrid in this map, and the hybrid system would be using both wind and solar to produce hydrogen from an electrolyzer. Whereas in the fast green scenario, the picture that emerges is that Europe is basically split into two. The northern part of Europe that is using, or the northern part of Europe where wind is a cheaper way to produce hydrogen than solar, and then the southern Europe where the picture is reversed and solar is much cheaper than wind. When we move on to the 2050 picture, we can appreciate that in the blue-green scenario, the methane reforming and CCS is not there anymore in those countries where CCS is allowed, because the production of hydrogen through renewable wind and electrolysis is actually becomes economically preferred. Whereas in the fast green scenario, the key trend is that solar becomes a much more dominant technology over wind. And this is the result of the sharp decline in the solar PV cost, but also in the electrolyzer cost, which in the case of the economics of a solar PV and electrolyzer plant makes up for a larger share of the total cost, being solar PV panels relatively cheaper than wind, but also having a lower load factor. So how did we combine the two pictures shown so far? So the demand side of things and the supply side of things. We call this phase the delivery system phase. And what we looked at effectively is what would be the best way to connect demand points and supply points. So in this chart, I brought together the wind and solar and CCS with SMR production across Europe, and the spots that are more green imply a higher cost of production of hydrogen, whereas the ones that are more towards the yellow imply a lower cost of producing hydrogen. So the key question here is, are the differences in hexagons enough to pay for an infrastructure to transport hydrogen around? So to do so, we made a number of assumptions, again, on the cost of infrastructure, where we assessed the cost of pipelines, both repurpose, which means using existing gas pipes and repurposing them to transport hydrogen, as well as new pipelines. And then we also considered the cost of storage of hydrogen, as well as the transport of hydrogen as liquefied hydrogen and as ammonia, which could also be seen as a carrier of hydrogen. Finally, we calculated a cost of delivered hydrogen, both as volatile, as we called it, which means hydrogen delivered but not stored, and also smooth, meaning that you also take into account some cost for storage to smooth out the supply throughout the year. So what have been the approach that we took? The approach that we took was to use a hexa model, again, to come back to the hexagon structure, where we first calculated the local levelized cost of hydrogen, or LCOH, coming from the supply phase that I described, and then assessing the cost of storage and adding on the levelized cost of storage, or LCOS, and then finally the cost of transporting the hydrogen, smooth hydrogen in this case when storage is factored in, to the to the demand hexagon. So this concept of a hexagrid can be applied to any geography, and you can see below an example of how an hexagrid would fit the north of Italy and the east coast of the UK. And then the chart on the right-hand side shows an example of an output of our model. In this case, it shows it for the fast green scenario in 2050. And this is how the hydrogen backbone would look like according to our model. So as you can see, the result is that the hydrogen transport and storage would be very much needed under the conditions, under the no-regret conditions that we imposed for this study. So what are the key messages and takeaways from the studies? So the first one about demand is that hydrogen demand clusters will arise and will become more noticeable in 2050, and will be concentrated around large ammonia, steel, and petrochemical plants, although we assume that petrochemical plants, which are refineries, will disappear by 2050. But still, the ammonia and steel plants would still be the centers of hydrogen demand. The second key message is about supply. So the cheapest way to supply hydrogen to each location is really much dependent on the technology cost assumption. But by 2050, when we make certain assumptions about technology cost reduction, we can reasonably believe that hydrogen can be fully produced with electrolysis. And then finally, when we come to the main conclusion of the delivery system analysis, we identified 4 main corridors. We call them no-regret corridors, which are displayed on the picture on the right-hand side. And these corridors have been identified by looking at both scenarios, fast green and blue green, and looking across the year. And we saw that these specific 4 places remained consistently in need of some infrastructure to be built when you vary the technology cost assumption across the scenarios, and also as demand evolved over the years. So as such, we thought that these 4 places are definitely some corridors worth investing in, and by definition and by the question that we were asked by the client, these would be places where if you invested in infrastructure, you wouldn't regret into the future, because under a range of conditions, you would need those infrastructure to be there. So that was the end of my presentation. If you would like to reach out to me, here is my email address. I also put a link to explore further the results of the project. We published an online Tableau file, which can be used by anyone, and there are some nice visualizations that you can have a look at. It's this tiny URL here. And then finally, if you're interested, you can subscribe to our podcast. In the latest episode, my colleague John Williams talked to someone at Equinor about hydrogen, and you can also follow webinars on energy topics from A3 at this address here, so A3/webinars. Thank you very much for listening, And if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I will be very happy to answer if I can.
Thank you very much, Stefano. So we've actually got 2 questions already. So the first one is, thanks for the informative presentation. Can you please highlight the environmental trade-offs, if any, related to hydrogen developments and storage?
This is a very good question, and very relevant, because bearing in mind that hydrogen needs to be part of the solution to decarbonization and not part of the problem. This is not something that we looked at in this specific study, but rather is more of a principle question. When we go back to the hydrogen colors that I showed in one of the first slides, what you can see is that hydrogen can be produced by emitting 0 emissions, and that could be hydrogen produced with solar PV or offshore wind, or onshore wind and electrolysis. But it can also be produced and emitting CO2. So if you consider gray hydrogen, so methane reforming, you have a carbon intensity of about 9 kilograms of CO2 emitted for each kilogram of hydrogen. And when you use coal to produce hydrogen through gasification, that carbon intensity is even higher. When you consider blue hydrogen, you have something in between. So you have a very good level of CO2 emission reduction. Some of the newest technology of carbon capture and storage, coupled with methane reforming, can reduce emissions up to 97% compared to gray hydrogen. But you still have some leftover emissions in the sector or in the production phase. The other angle to look at is what are the emissions involved in the production of hydrogen across the entire supply chain. So before the actual production phase, if you are using fossil fuels, then it's likely you're likely to have additional emissions. If it's the case of methane, there are the so-called fugitive emission, which are emissions resulting from the extraction and handling process of the natural gas, and so those would obviously add to the emission that occur during the production phase. Of course, green hydrogen also has some emissions when you manufacture the electrolyzer or the turbines or solar PV, but they are much smaller, and so it's widely regarded as a carbon neutral solution.
Cool. The next one is, also, it would be highly appreciated if you could share your thoughts in regard to the cost effectiveness of green hydrogen compared to conventional hydrogen in Europe.
Yeah, that's also one of the current challenges of hydrogen. So when you look at the current cost of gray hydrogen or conventional hydrogen, you're looking at a range of about 1 to 1.5 euro per kilo of hydrogen. That is gray hydrogen. When you look at green hydrogen, then the cost of production today is probably closer to over 5 or 6 euro per kilogram of hydrogen. So a fairly big gap. What all the strategies from the European Union and other countries claim is that with the scaling up of the electrolyzers, but also the renewables, you will have cost declines due to learnings, so economies of scales, for example, or better ways to manufacture, or use of less expensive components, and therefore leading to a lower costs for these the components to produce hydrogen, and therefore an overall cost of the objective would be to reach a parity between green hydrogen and gray hydrogen. Certainly with the assumptions that we made in the project I mentioned, rapid decline in electrolyzers and renewables, we saw that by 2050, green hydrogen became cheaper than even blue hydrogen, which is more expensive than gray conventional hydrogen, given that the CCS infrastructure costs on top of the pure methane reforming infrastructure.
Cool, thank you. And then final question, which sort of links. Do you expect support schemes to be enacted by the EU and member states to support clean hydrogen production? And how sensitive is your modelling to such support schemes?
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky question, because I suppose that at the moment there are no explicit support schemes except for one in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands has a subsidy scheme called the SD++ to incentivize renewables, and it also covers electrolysis as one of the technologies. However, most other countries don't have an explicit support scheme. But when you look at the commitments of the EU, saying that they will spend about 450 billion, they will need to support hydrogen production, hydrogen demand, and also infrastructure. So there will be support across the entire value chain. They just have not been announced yet and not been, they're not explicit at the moment, but I'm sure that if we want to reach the levels envisaged by the ambitions, there will need to be subsidies, even just to scale up the production and achieve the required scale to then reduce costs.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that's all of our questions for today.
That's brilliant.
So thank you very much. I hope everyone's enjoyed the talk, and thank you very much, Afri and Stefano, for coming and talking to us today.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
And I hope you have a good end of term. And we've got committee elections coming up. So, there's one more question that's popped up. Have you got a second to answer the last one?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so one question from Annalyn here. What do you think can be done to push for hydrogen production, especially in the no-regret corridors?
So I think that in practical terms, governments will need to establish some roadmaps and explore in much more detail what demand centers and supply centers are there in their countries. So this study was done at a certain level of granularity. So as I said, we defined this Exogrid, and as you saw, the hexagons were quite wide, so we did not plan specific pipeline routes or hydrogen storage facilities. But what countries could do would be to explore in much more detail what the hydrogen users would be and what the hydrogen producers would be in their country, probably focusing on these 4 no-regret corridors, and identify some practical locations where a pipeline could be repurposed. That would be the first and most obvious way to proceed, as the cost of repurposing an existing gas pipeline are much lower than building a new one, but also planning to build hydrogen storage, which we think is definitely going to be part of the energy transition, even to mitigate the intermittency of renewables, and perhaps to build a new hydrogen pipelines in locations where they would be required.
Cool. I think that answers the question. So thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoyed.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me. And likewise, I hope that you enjoyed the presentation.
Bye, everyone.